he's just there. Okay, this session is... Okay.
Just use...
Swap. Okay, this
Hello.
session is going to get started. It's on gender, climate and security for First Nations and Pacific women. I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director at ActionAid Australia. I'm also a co-chair of the Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security. The Coalition is delighted to be hosting this session in partnership with ActionAid Australia and Shifting the Power Coalition in the Pacific. So I guess just to kick off, as many of you will be aware, about 10 years ago, COP established the first Lima work program on gender to advance gender balance and integrate gender perspectives into implementing the Convention and the Paris Agreement to achieve gender-responsive climate policy and action. Its priorities include women's participation and leadership, policy coherence, and gender-responsive implementation. So today's session is going to focus around the gendered impacts of climate change from an intersectional lens, obviously looking at the perspectives from First Nations and Pacific women. It will also focus on showcasing women-led responses that are supporting gender equality and climate outcomes in the Pacific region. We're also going to explore how First Nations women's voices can be better integrated into climate responses and how we can better support gender-responsive and inclusive climate action and financing in the Pacific region, where climate change is considered the biggest security threat to regional security and stability. And I think through that, also looking at how a WPS lens can be applied in this context. So just to start by introducing our fantastic lineup, we have Sandra Creamer, AM, who is a Wanyi and Kalkadoon woman from Queensland, Australia. She's a strong advocate for the rights of First Nations people and adjunct professor of public health at the University of Queensland. Sandra has been part of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and co-chair of its Global Indigenous Women's Caucus. She was also a contributing author to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2022, looking at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability as part of the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. Sandra is also part of the National Domestic Violence Framework in Australia. Welcome, Sandra. Woohoo! Yay. Flora Vano is the Country Manager of ActionAid Vanuatu, which is supporting women's leadership in responding to climate change and disasters through the Women Talk Talk Together network, which reaches more than 9,000 women on 5 islands and is driving gender transformative change alongside inclusive climate action. Welcome, Flora. And last but not least, Carolyn Kitione from Fiji is the regional representative of the Shifting the Power Coalition in the Pacific. It's a feminist coalition that brings together 13 women-led organisations, including the Regional Disability Forum, to advance Pacific women's leadership on climate and humanitarian action, including innovative feminist financing models, which we'll be hearing about. But so let's get started. Sandra, let's start with you. I mean, I think in terms of setting the context, how is climate change impacting on the security of First Nations women?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge all our Indigenous peoples from around the world. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional lands that they come from, and I'd like to also acknowledge one of our elders here, Auntie Rose. Thank you for always being a leader for us, for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. So what was the question again?
How is climate change impacting on the security of First Nations women?
Well, for myself, I work around Australia quite often in remote communities especially. Climate change. There's heat and we're overheated, and there's also rain. So one of the things when I do in my work is what they do is for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women, we had to fight for recognition of our land through our native title. First of all, that's what happened. We don't have full ownership of our land. native title has only given us recognition to the land. A lot of us are still on land leases. So in Northern Territory in particular, one of the areas that I do work in is there's 80% of mining in Aboriginal land in Northern Territory. And so what do they do when it comes to climate change? How are they adapting? What are they able to be doing? Especially because a lot of that land is now, water is now going. So they are using their simple traditional techniques. That includes how are they getting their water in some of these remote communities, how are they using it, and how are they making security for themselves in such vast areas where there is limited water. So what I found when I'm working out in a lot of those communities is that they're restoring plants. They're restoring, and how they're restoring it is by getting their traditional plants that are for eating, that are for their seeds, and also for those seeds can also be turned into food. So what they do is, what they've been doing is, well, they have to, how do they store their water? It's through water tanks. A lot of them are bringing water tanks back into those communities because that's the only way that they're going to get water. Because the bore water underground, as I was saying, 80% of the land in Northern Territory has mining on it. So there's a lot of water mines taking those waters. So from that, they're looking at, okay, this is for now, but what are they doing for the future? So from the food that they make, from the beads that they sell, Aboriginal women, Torres Strait Islander women, Indigenous women in this world, they're business women, whether they're just selling their beads or whether they're making bread and selling that, they're business women. So they need to look at through that economic gain that they're doing to restore security under climate change. So what they're doing is, okay, well, we don't have the finance because of our native title. We have to look at doing security through our food process and restoring security on our land, which is vastly remote. I can tell you now, if you don't know where some of these homelands are, you are going to get lost. That's how vast the lands are. That's where they are living so remotely. They don't have, all they can rely on is rainwater and bore water under the climate change. But they're saying, well, we need to be able to restore, plant, and bringing back those plants, especially for traditional knowledge for medicine, is one of the main things that they're doing, is bringing that traditional knowledge back. But those plants, and as we know, for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Indigenous peoples around this world, we're survivors. We understand and we know our traditional knowledge to our plants, to the waters. Our traditional knowledge is what we're restoring back for security. It's bringing back, how do we preserve water? How do we live when sometimes in some of those communities they're not getting rain for nearly up to 2 or 3 years? How are we going to have that security when generally there were 6 cycles for Aboriginal people in that area of the weather, but now it's just winter and summer, and there's rain in between. So that security is about staying on their homelands, looking at restoring everything through their traditional knowledge, through restoring water, and also not being greedy, not taking all of the water in one bucket, not taking all of the water from the water plant, but it's about how they are balancing their life for water and the life for food, which is the main thing. So it's very difficult. So for them, they're doing it for the now. But for us, we have to think about how are they going to do it for the future, because we know that heat is extreme and water is scarce. So that is for the now. They're looking at security. But continuing on, we've got to look at for the next 7 generations for us when it comes to restoring land, water, sea, everything for us to survive. Because everyone needs to understand water is life. That's the most important thing that we have to have. If we don't have water, we're not going to have life. That is the main security that we need in climate change to be able to survive. So that's their way of doing it now, is their security is restoring that water through water tanks. using those balls, how they are limiting themselves on that ball, but also what they're doing is turning it into a business to make security, to benefit money sharing, but as well as for that money benefit that they're getting, they can continue to buy more water tanks in those communities. But it's that simple technique that they have to use. When they don't have technology out there, they don't have phones in some of those communities, they are very limited, but it's their traditional knowledge that have been passed down from generation to generation, and that is how we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are starting to use our own simple techniques to be able to restore security for us in climate change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And I think obviously highlighting the profound effects on food, water, land, but also the incredible resilience of First Nations women building on their traditional knowledge, which I think is a really important theme as we think about this from an intersectional perspective. Flora, I'll move to you. Obviously, climate change has been considered the biggest security threat to the Pacific. I guess taking a lens from Pacific women, how is climate change impacting on women in Vanuatu?
Thank you, Auntie Michelle. Recognizing our pre-existing issues in country. So Vanuatu within the Pacific, we are a patriarchy society, which means it's mainly male dominated. And I am here with, talking on behalf of the women that we work with, on behalf of Women in Tok Together, 9,000 women that I am here with. So being in COP, it's not only coming in to be part of it, but having that voice that actually talks about the realities of what we are facing on small island states, especially in my country, in Vanuatu. We only have one female in our national parliament, and that is already saying that our voices are not there. Now, adding on to those, the impact of climate change, that every year the intensity of tropical cyclone became more severe each time. The last one that we had that was so severe was 1986. And then almost 2-3 decades later, 2015, we have another one that is a category 5. And then because of those climate change, we could see 2020, we had another category 5 cyclone. And then last year, 2023, we got twin cyclones, both in a level of category 4, which means any thatch roof, any traditional houses that we know we've built, our ancestors survive on it, are not able to withstand those cyclones. Right after the twin cyclone in 2023, the off-season cyclones hit us, Tropical Cyclone Lola. And that, we were picking up our roof, we are trying to plant, to harvest our food from the garden. The next cyclone came and wiped it all away. And of course, that's where we tried to voice it at COP28 in Dubai. And while we were there, the pacifiers have been put to us to shut because they've already put in money for loss and damage. And I think for me, it's a reality check that not everything, can be said and done. You have to be in it to live it, to talk it, to make sure that it happens, as it said. We have loss of livelihood when those cyclones strike. Food insecurity, water insecurity. The increase of gender-based violence is among our communities. Increase of unpaid care work. Sea level rises. Of course, when the ice melt on the other side, we get the brunt because of our land keep moving. Our sea coastal keep chipping away by the sea. Landslide happening, ash falls, acid rain. Our island is made out of ring of fire, right on that plate. And therefore, the heat, the global warming can be made. We also got the natural heat that happens every now and then. Which means for women at the coastal areas, fish and shellfishes and livelihood that they can just get from the sea is now moving further away, which get the women to negotiate for canoes. They don't have boats. They are not carvers. They don't carve wood. They have to negotiate with land. Displacement happens. They have to move from one community to the next. And they are the one caring for the family. And they are the one at the front line each time it happens. And that's what life is for me and my other sisters in country.
Thanks, Flora. I mean, I think we often talk about how climate change is impacting those countries that have done the least to cause the problem with the fewer resources to cope. And I think when we bring a gender lens to it, we can see it's even more profound in terms of livelihoods, you know, and the ability to survive. So thanks for sharing the reflections on Vanuatu. Carolyn, let's turn to you. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but I guess this is a global agenda that's been mobilised to look at how can we support women's participation in peace building, conflict resolution, and recognising also the growing impacts of climate change on conflict and insecurity. It also looks at a range of other things like the prevention of violence, protection of the most vulnerable, and how we can drive more inclusive relief and recovery. So I guess I wanted to turn to you, Carolyn, to ask, you know, in this context of policy coherence, you know, do you think that the WPS agenda can be a useful framework as we think about responding to the gendered impacts of climate change?
Thank you. And I think I'm probably speaking to the converted here, but I just want to, you know, also trigger some thinking around how we are framing what security and peace means to us. Because when we're working in the Pacific, we've had, and when we're working with our communities in particular, we've had to ask the women to define what conflict means to them, what peace means to them. And when we are working in a global space, the traditional thinking is to use peace and security to mean traditional security in the forms of militarism, armed conflict. And so, but for our communities, particularly in places like remote Fiji or even in small countries like Tuvalu, Niue, that kind of armed conflict does not exist for us. And so when we are talking about conflict and security in the global sense, we also have to be clear that in the Pacific, it means something completely different. We also know that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, because the movement, climate justice, it's about people and our security. And we also know that, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, and you'll hear it a lot at the Moana Pavilion, that our Pacific leaders through the Pacific Islands Forum, of which your government, Australia, is a member of, they've recognized climate change as the biggest security threat in the region. And yet, while we continue to see the linkages between peace, security, and climate change, our governments have not exactly seen the same thing. Our security response to addressing climate change has still been to increase funding for the military. For some of our Pacific governments, the meteorological and climate change departments still lie within the Ministry of Defense. And that still has a very traditional focus on armed conflict. And so even in spaces like this, while we can see the clear linkages between peace and security and climate change, it's not always so evident everywhere else. In COP, this is my first time at COP, but this is not the first time I'm constantly hearing that climate change affects women disproportionately. We already know that. We are living proof of that. You don't need to keep reminding us that that is the reality for most women in the world. But what is also becoming evidently clear to us in this work, and what we're also hoping to influence into the policy spaces, is that the women are also leading the climate responses in their communities. And not just the climate responses, they are also leading peace-building efforts in their communities. 20 years ago, when we still had the Bougainville conflict happening in country, it was the women mobilizing to stop the men from continuing even further. There are multiple stories coming out of the Pacific of women leading the peace-building movements, and yet that is not a piece of history that is recognized. And so when we lean on the legacy of the women's movement in the Pacific, we know that there are interlinkages between the different social movements that currently exist. We also know that despite the evidence, the growing evidence that women are leading, and despite all the resources that we are pouring into building capacity, and I really detest that phrase because we're not building capacity, we're meant to be strengthening and supporting capacity that already exists. When we pour resources into that area of work, we are still unable to enter decision-making spaces. If those of us who are tracking COP negotiations and tracking all the statements across multiple platforms, not just within the climate change space, but also within the disaster management spaces, very few of them will actually talk about gender. The few times they do talk about gender, we're at the tail end of the statement. And that's not real commitment to the political commitments and the global commitments that are already in place. And I think for those of us with a bare understanding of the WPS agenda, it's really about 4 key pillars: participation, prevention, but also relief and recovery. And I'm forgetting one more, but it'll come to me in a while. And so we can link what the WPS agenda is doing with what we're seeing as a security threat in the Pacific through the climate change movement. But it's also about, and this is something that's come up in our discussions around peace and security and the 1325 agenda and subsequent resolutions, is that it's about also recognizing the initiatives that already exist, the women-led initiatives that already exist. I'm going to go off on a bit of a vent here, but please bear with me. We're constantly talking about building capacity for women in the communities. But we already know, working in the movement, working in the communities, that that capacity already exists. Fine. We also know that there's a lack of representation of women in decision-making spaces. Fine. We also know that there are global commitments that have already been made, but there is no political will to connect the different moving pieces. And that's a real shame, because you could save so much more money and so much more time if you just worked with what already exists. And that's what we're trying to do through the Shifting the Power Coalition with our partners. It's working with our governments to support movements and organizing that already exist in the communities. We're not trying to build something new. We're also not trying to create whole new task force and networks, and we're not trying to create new machineries. We're using the information that already exists and trying to make the linkages between not just the intermediaries through our partners to the governments and to the communities. It's about actually bringing both communities and governments to the same table. And that's one of the goals of the WPS agenda, elevating women's leadership in these different spaces. And as we're coming up as young women in the movements as well, we can see how many of us in the movement are already burnt out. But it's also about learning to sustain the movement and be persistent. We heard that in the earlier panel, the need to be persistent in our efforts. But there's also the recognition that we need the resources, and these don't need to be just financial. These can also be technical and operational as well. Those kind of resources also need to be in place in order to sustain movements. But if you're going to sustain movements, you also need to look at investing in young women's capacity to understand what's happening. There are quite a few of us who are here at COP for the first time. We walk in, nobody explains to us what the meeting rooms are for, what the side event rooms are for, what plenaries are for. Then we're sitting in caucus meetings and people then tell us, actually, your yellow badges don't allow you to speak in these spaces. Your pink badges, depending on what's written on the pink badges, you may not be allowed in certain rooms. I say, okay, but then what's the point of putting us as part of your number, as part of your database in these spaces? You are supporting 30% of that leadership, but you're not actually allowing us to speak. So what is the point? But also, when we're talking about sustainability of the movement, and this is a big part of the WPS agenda, it's also talking about the follow-up action from here. There are many of us who have not been to COP but have been tracking the conversations that are very worried about whether this is just going to be another COP where we all walk away disappointed and tired, or if there's real political commitment to go further than what we had last year. And so the agenda is about amplifying women's leadership, and not just women's leadership in the political sense, but also within the different movements that we lead. Are we able to enter the negotiation spaces, the decision-making spaces that allow us to address climate security risks such as food insecurity, health insecurity? We underwent 2 periods of El Nino, and a lot of the countries in the Pacific region had drought for months. And even before it was officially declared drought season, there had been periods of dry spells in these communities. And so when we don't have women who we know have been responsible for managing their homes in the decision-making spaces, these priorities become not priorities to our governments. And so we need to keep pushing that. And so within the WPS agenda, there's been real work from the coalition, to keep elevating, but also investing in action that already exists, and then also amplifying innovation that comes from the grassroots communities. Because it does not make sense if we are supporting urban-based actors who have no connection to their villages, to their homes, to their communities. You can't come in as an external party, and I know this as a young woman who grew up in urban Suva, cannot go back to the island of Rotuma and tell people, this is the conversation that's happening up in the global spaces. This is something new that we have to do. You have to understand the environment as well. And I guess one of the beauties of someone who has spent the early years of her professional life, understanding and learning about these things, that makes sense to always go back to listen. But as we go back and listen, we also have to learn to listen to understand and not just listen to respond. So, I'm done.
Fabulous. And woohoo, yeah. I was just thinking, imagine if we could just transport Carolyn into the meeting of global leaders right now and just give them that message. Because, political will, I think we're all sick of empty commitments, and I think it has to be on the table that we need to see more of that. Definitely more women's leadership. Those of us who saw the photo yesterday of the world leaders, I think there were 8 women in the mix. It's pretty stark. Until women are at the table in their diversity, we won't move forward. And I think the other thing I thought it's a really important takeaway in the context of everything we're talking about, if we want to find climate finance, let's look at our military budgets, because they are definitely heading in the wrong direction. Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, back to you, Sandra. So I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but Sandra recently published a report on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's voices and engagement in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I guess, Sandra, building on these findings, I wanted to ask you, how do you think governments can strengthen their engagement with First Nations communities, including women, and better integrate these perspectives into climate responses?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think one of the things is, yes, it's okay to write a report, and don't just treat us like a token, but have us at the table. That's the main thing. If we're not at the table, we're going to be on the table. And one of the most important things is that they need to be working with us. Don't treat us like a token, because we're not. For Indigenous people and for women, especially for Indigenous people, we know our land. We have our songs long, we are connected to the traditional dancing, and we have our spiritual connection to the land. So that's been passed on from generation to generation. Understand our roles as caretakers, understand our roles and our duties as stewardships to this world. Because again, it's not just about, okay, we're all here and we know we got the Aboriginal painting there and we have our fire burning up there. The reality is, have us at the table. Have us as partners at the table. Have us there when we have to talk about policy, when we have to talk about finance, when we have to talk about resources. It's really important that they understand that we're just not talking, but understand our way as Indigenous peoples. It's not just about one way is the right way. That's not the reality of it. One way, right way is not it. It's understanding the ways of other peoples in this world, and that's what I think that governments must have understand. And also remember to bring the voices of women to the table as well. Because if women were born, we bear our children. If we did not have that, we would not have a nation. And the government must remember how important as mothers we are to our Mother Earth, how we are the number one caretakers, how we understand our duties in our homes as well as caring for land and country and for the sea. So continue to have us at the table. But, you can write 20 million reports. I came here 13 years ago when it was in Ngora. And all the paper in the world, all the voices in the world, it's it's still the same. Indigenous peoples aren't at the table. Women are only a minority at the table. So we have to all work as a collective together. You know, having women's group, having Indigenous groups, having this group, having that group. You know, when we're coming here, all walk together and talk together. And that's why we need to be raising our voices. We need to be here talking about the reality of having us at the table, having us involved, having us as partners. Don't just treat us that, you know, 60,000 people registered to come to COPE this year, and, you know, we have all this, and we're, you know, the economic for this country is, you know, we know has gone sky high, and we're supporting everything. No. Support us as people. Support us as a human race of people to this world, and we are the human beings. We are here not just for now. It's not about today. It's not about just being here. But remember, we're here for the next 7 generations. And we all have a common vision. It's about climate change. It's about how to save this world, how we are going to be able to survive, how we're going to overcome the damage and the rape of our jewels under our feet, especially for our Indigenous lands, how we are going to overcome the pollutions of water, how we're going to look at the overfishing in our world, how we're going to feed our children, and how we're going to have clean air, clean water for the next 7 generations. It's not just about a report. It's about having us as partners and how to make a better world for our children, our grandchildren, and to go on, because that's what we're all here about. And I think that's why it's important that we continue to be a voice. Raise whatever you have to raise. Be real when you're here. Don't just come here and just, okay, I've gone around to plenty of the pavilions listening to other people, and we're all talking the same language. It's about climate change. It's about having us all at the table, changing policies. Don't let mining companies, you know, stop amending our acts where mining companies can still, you know, pollute our waters. Have a look at what banks, who are funding the banks. Have a look at what the principles that are supposed to be in place for banks under the business violations of banks. Banks also have a principle when it comes to lending and to mines or anyone that is polluting or they're doing damage on any land. I know for a fact, you know, and for Adani in Australia, it was a very big issue out in our country. One of the banks that pulled up was, and I'll give credit to, was Commonwealth Bank, because of the principles when it comes to environmental damage. Understand and know what those principles are for banks. Understand when we're talking to people that, okay, we know. We're not just here as individuals, we're here as a human race. We know the rights and wrong of this world, and that's why I think that we need to, well, I don't think, I know that we need to be having more of us grassroots people at the table and not just the suit-up people who they think that should be at the table. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Yeah, let's give her a clap. Very clear messages there around how do we get over this tokenism. You know, it's not just about participation, but without actually listening to the voices and creating a seat in decision-making tables, I think. And we're hearing a really strong echo. There's so much that we can learn from, obviously, First Nations, but also, you know, Pacific women that can really enhance our responses to climate change. And just for those who don't know, I'll just do a shout out because ActionAid does have a global campaign, Fund Our Future, which is targeting the top 10 banks globally that continue to finance the fossil fuel crisis. And so if you want to know more, do come and talk to us afterwards, because I think we do need to put pressure on those who are continuing to finance. It's just not acceptable when we're already on track to reach 3.1 degrees. Okay, Flora. So we've heard, I mean, Carolyn raised the issue that, you know, let's stop talking about building capacity. Let's start recognising the existing capacity that's there in the Pacific. So I thought it'd be great to hear from you about what are women in Vanuatu doing to respond to climate change through the Women Talk Together network.
Thank you. So We have established Women Need to Talk Together network in 2015 when ActionAid Australia responded to Vanuatu on Tropical Cyclone Pam. And from there, that's where the women recognized that there are no safe space because the traditional architecture in our own community and tribe doesn't allow women to be in those decision-making spaces. We were excluded within our own home, our own community, our village, our district area, and then also right towards the national. We were not part of all the decision-making. Now, with Women in Talk Together, we have trained women leaders, 400 women leaders on woman-led community-based protection. It's a framework signatory to ActionAid that it enables local women to look at their issues during normal time and then like peacetime and also during crisis. And that framework really helped within the network because our network women are not women that are educated. Those of the women that are in this network are women that have gone through colonialization, slavery, right from the onset before we got independence in 1980. So they are still having that mindset. The first generation from there are still having that mindset. Now, our generation, I think we are the fourth generation coming. We are now trying to break that barrier, but it's going to be hard because of what we have encountered with our ancestors. However, Women in Talk Together invest on training women on leadership in humanitarian action so they can be able to assist in preparedness and early warning, getting the family to safety. And I think that is one thing the men in country doesn't do well, but the women does. Because we look at food, we look at clothing, we look at kits, we look at our valuables, certificates, anything that we know that if disaster strike, we might lost, we actually make sure we prepare them in good time. We also establish economic hubs in all the sites that we are in. Now, economic hubs actually related to the violence, financial violence. Conflict arises when women don't have money, don't have food on the table. If they cannot earn anything, they have to depend on the very hands that beat them up to provide for them. But if we do provide for the women, making accessible livelihood and economic places, then those things shouldn't come about. And this is what we have done to decrease violence in financial violence. We were also learning women on climate resilient, sustainable agriculture, which delivers on the ground. Women plant 3 gardens. One is for their economic, for their livelihood. One garden they sell at the market, they get their money, they're in charge of the money. And they can make the decision. The other one is to feed their children. We have acknowledged also malnutrition, health issues. Why? Because the women have to put their families forward before themselves. They feed them before they feed themselves. Sometimes they don't eat. They will only eat 1 or 2 meals. So that come into play. We are targeting our health, malnutrition and health, other health risks that we have. We also have another garden that is meant for disasters. Now, why do we have that garden? We have seen that in twin cyclone, the women have planted within 48 hours all their crops that they were about to harvest gone, just gone. And they did not have enough to sustain again. Now, our other network that were not affected by the twin cyclone collected food from the disaster garden and came and brought food to come and deliver it, response to the women. And this is locally led by women. No chiefs, no men, but women. And I think I'm proud to say that though we had all the differences, but we rise up from those differences and try to make our voice, our space as women being recognized in the face of disaster crisis, even the climate change, most impactful disaster that we had. We also have within the network Woman Wet and Weather, a multi-hazard early warning system that allows women to actually get information from the climate officers, but simplified messaging to them. Because remember I told you, they were not educated. they cannot know all the scientist words that are coming out from the scientist. So in order for them to also prepare their houses, they need to know what is it that they can do to survive. Now, I'll give a very practical example on that. If we have rain forecast for 5 days, women that are near the rivers, we already know the rivers will go flash flooding. We don't tell them that we will have rain for 4 to 5 days. We just tell them rivers will be flash flooding. If you are to get groceries from the other side, you do it before the rain starts. You actually prep your kids not to go to school, but got some homeworks for them to do at home before they cross the river, because this is child protection issue. Kids go lost, go missing on the rivers, and they don't come back. We send them to school, they never return home. And that is a constant worry for women in communities. And they don't, it's not a normal, it's not business as usual for them to listen on weather forecast about what we are saying. But it's the practicality on what they will do that prevent things that will happen, that stress them, create conflict, and even create violence. So, of course, the multi-hazard early warning was a partnership between a private sector company, now Telstra, Digicel, and then also with all the women that are in the community, especially getting them to understand what technology is, what phones are. Some of them never uses phones. Introducing. So while we are looking at empowering women leadership, we're also looking at technology that can enhance their leadership while they're, being at the community level. We also make sure that protection referral pathways are being there. Now, we don't have police posts in a lot of our islands, in our community. And therefore, women couldn't call the police and tell them my husband is beating me up here. Because if your husband is beating you up, you call the police, it will take 2, 3, or 4 days to reach you. And by the time it reaches you, the husband already caught up with you and beat you up more, which means sometimes a lot of them lost their lives. And sometimes a lot of them just go suicidal, because what is there? We can't protect. We know the services, but it's too far away. We didn't get them close. Now, Women Need to Talk Together also create a safe space in which, while violence is going on, they can share what issues they have, and so there can be psychosocial support within that system. Now, because they're very, very remote, even boats going to their islands once every 4 months in some location. And that means they won't taste sugar, they won't see salt for their food. A lot of things. Yeast for making bread, just for their kids to go to school, those things are not there. And in Port Vila, we are privileged to press, turn on the tap of the running water, turn on lights, which this is not the same for a lot of the women we work with. And we are also looking on getting energy towards the women for solar, since water issue is a big problem. And when there's drought, women have to walk 3 to 4 miles to reach water. By the time they're coming back, they have to attend to the kids. So unpaid care work is actually rising as we speak in the face of climate change. So we try to make spaces and accessible resources for women in community where government resources are not there. So we take that extra mile to bridge that gap.
Okay, thanks, Flora. Amazing work. And Flora shares with you the context alongside the work that women do, and I think what's incredible is that women are driving the agenda as they see it, as it unfolds, and determining what their priorities are. And the Women Wet and Wetter Early Warning Network, just so you have a sense of its size, it reaches 40% of the population. Women have a phone tree network that they mobilise when a crisis hits, alongside using mobile phone technology. So these aren't just they are grassroots community efforts, but they are also reaching scale. So when people say nice little community-led initiatives can't reach scale, I think it's important to highlight that they can, and women are doing extraordinary things when given resources and technology. We are doing terrible on time management. I am sorry. We really want to have a moment for questions. So I'm just going to ask Just very briefly, but Carolyn, I mean, you can take a little bit longer, but still briefly. How is the coalition also supporting women's leadership, Pacific women's leadership on climate change? And also, I mean, can you share the feminist funding model approach that the coalition has as well as we think about gender responsive climate finance?
Thank you. The whole point of me carrying my tablet up here was because I had a script to stick to time, and I will try to stick to time, but I do welcome questions after. I think from our inception in 2016, it was quite clear that no one partner had the expertise, and as we were talking about influencing and trying to transform the regional architecture around humanitarian mechanisms in the Pacific, it was clear that we wanted expertise from diverse women's movements. And so the coalition is actually, the makeup of the coalition is actually reflected in the expertise that exists. Our women leaders come from the Young Women's Networks through the YWCAs in the region. We also have women leaders from the peace building networks, those who have existing humanitarian expertise. And so while you have all these women in the space, and those of us who have organized in women's spaces, we know that sometimes there are intergenerational dynamics that also come into play as well. There's power dynamics that we have to address. And also the fact that we aren't just based in one country. And so in working across multiple Pacific countries as well, we also have to engage and understand and build our understanding of the different cultural power plays as well. There are those of us who are very dominant in the South Pacific who can sometimes speak over those of us who come from the Northern Pacific as well. There are those of us who come from the Western Pacific who don't often find themselves allied to those of us from down south. And so we also have to address the geographical power plays as well that comes out in our political spaces as well. And so as a coalition, as we're talking about financing for grassroots, community-based, women-led organizations, it's about building that trust as well. Our first few years as a coalition, we didn't have any funding. And so those years, we actually spent trying to build an understanding of where we can compromise, but also where best can we work to advance the agenda. And the common agenda was in transforming that humanitarian architecture that currently exists in the Pacific. It's about creating that cross-regional learning as well. Because while we all face climate change, we don't face it the same way. There are those of us in the Pacific who can go through months of drought, and then there are those of us who can go through months of flooding. Extremely different experiences to climate change. And then there are those of us who don't face the same impact as well because we come from highland communities where we're facing earthquakes rather than flooding and drought seasons. And so in building those experiences, and I'm glad that Flora has had the opportunity to talk about Women Weta Mweta, it's about supporting the different types of innovation coming as well around early warning systems. When we are attending disaster management conferences, when we talk about early warning systems, the default focus has been on response. But we are quickly learning from networks like the WIT Federation, from the YWCA networks, that it's also about preparedness. And it isn't just in the lead up to preparing for a disaster, it's the months of work and the analysis that it's taken to identify what those emerging and existing trends are. But that takes up a lot of time and that takes up a lot of capacity as well. And so while we've always worked with development partners to resource financially the expertise and the localization of these programs and of the work, it's also been important for us to identify that sometimes we need long-term funding that goes beyond 3-year project deadlines that our donors are currently giving us. We have to do untied funding. We have to find donors, and sometimes we've had to turn away those who are willing to throw money at us, but we've had to turn them away because their agenda does not fit into the work that's already being done by our communities. We don't want to change the approach that the communities, that the women are leading. We want to find donors who are willing to work and willing to take a step back to let the women lead as they've always led. And so it's about building trust. And as we're building, that trust and solidarity, another component of the feminist funding model within the coalition is about prioritizing local leadership. ActionAid Australia didn't go in as another INGO because I've heard this story multiple times, and so I'll try to condense it while also doing justice to it. ActionAid Australia didn't just go into Vanuatu to respond to the disasters. They went in to support the local women's movement because that was asked of them. And that's what being an allyship is all about. Listening to understand rather than just listening to react to what the problem is. They helped support what the local leadership that already existed in the form of Flora and her network, and using cultural methods of organizing as communities, they were able to extend their reach from just beyond Port Vila to the other islands as well, using again their cultural connections, their familial connections to other islands. And that's what we're seeing in the Pacific. We have such strong connections to our families, even if it's just by name, but that's also ways that we are influencing action as collective grassroots. And that's how we move from grassroots to national level action as well. So it's always going to be about movement strengthening. There's been a common buzz term within the feminist space over the last few years around movement building. Movements exist, but our coordination needs to get a little bit better. We'll hear that in the feminist spaces as well. We also need to support the coordination that's already going on. But then you can't do that if there's no trust in your communities. And so as we're talking about flexible funding, a lot of it has to come back to the trust that we're building both as partners and as movements, but also as people who are very, very tired and are normally generally very reserved and very quiet. You can't just go in and using the same Western lens that we have, come in and tell Pacific rural communities that they have to do things a certain way. Sometimes we do have to take a step back and understand what feminism and what movement strengthening should look like for communities that don't have access to internet spaces, who don't have the same level of exposure to social justice movements at a global level. We have to remove all that, and I'm constantly being reminded by the older women in our communities as well. The work that we've started on, the journey, hasn't just started overnight. It's years, it's generations in the making. And our work as young women, and this is why we call for the investment of young women's efforts in these spaces, is to actually support the resourcing and the sustainability of these movements. But it comes back to that trust building and understanding that we can't tell people how to do what they've already done. And we can't keep telling them to come up with new solutions when we haven't done a good job in investing in existing commitments and existing solutions. Which is why and I'm jumping global commitments here, but when we come into CSW next year and we're looking at the review of Beijing Plus 30, there's going to be a real need to be realistic about whether we need a whole new framework or what other political will and resourcing is going to be needed to actually continue the work and strengthen the work that should have been done from 30 years ago.
Thanks, Carolyn. And for those who don't know, Beijing Plus 30 is the defining document about women's rights and empowerment globally. It's been completely under-prioritised, definitely over the last decade. So, yeah, perhaps we do need a new framework. Okay, Sandra's begged me for 1 minute on just transitions. And I think it's an important one because right at the moment there is a discussion going on just transitions and how, and Sandra's been doing some important work around First Nations perspectives. So, Sandra, tell us what you think the priorities are.
Thanks for that. And I'm only going to be very quick because I know there's another panel coming on. So one of the things is that sustainable development says leave no one behind. So this is a time now for restoring Indigenous ways of life and the responsibility and respect to live on our Mother Earth and to bring renewable energy. But at the same time, doing this just transition, it must uphold our human rights, our cultural integrity, inclusive and full participation and share prosperity. And just transition must meet these criteria. 50% of the world's transition are on our Indigenous lands. Therefore, a minimum standard is not good enough. There must be a priority to have the renewable energy, legal work, strategies, policies and projects and procedures. They're all elements of a just energy transition and climate mitigation. So that's why, for Indigenous people, that's why it's important to have all of those standards under the new just transition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Yeah. So if you are in the negotiations following that point, please do reach out to Sandra for more information. She's got an entire research project on it. Can I just open up to see if anyone does have any questions of our panel? If you don't, there's a couple of other things they can talk about, but just to see if there is something you would like to ask. Okay, I'll go to you, Flora. 1 minute on the work. I mean, when we talk about intersectional perspectives, one area that's often missed out is the situation for women with disabilities who face multiple forms of discrimination. So I thought maybe it's a great chance for you just to share a little bit about what ActionAid's doing in that space.
Thank you. So Women in Talk Together, we also have a platform called Women in Talk Together Sunshine, and they are women and girls with disability. So we train them the same way we train our normal women, but now it's their own participation within those spaces where, as women, are being able to secure those seats at the table. So we don't just go alone, but we go with our disability sisters. And therefore, they also have to talk about their own agenda while we are there. I can talk of women, of all issues, all priorities that we can. I cannot talk for women with disability. And therefore, the crucial inclusive approach that ActionAid took is integrating with disability into all the works that we do. So inclusive DRR, inclusive early warning. What are the key messages for women and girls with disability? How are they, making sure that they're included, leaving no one behind, nothing about us without us. Those terms, we also have to look at it on our way of working as women. So we don't just go alone, but we go along with them. While we are advancing women's rights and women's agenda in spaces, we need to hold them with us, hold their hands and take them forward, because spaces are not going to be provided for them. We have to create that spaces for them. We have to allow that. If we do not allow, they will always be forgotten, be neglected, be leaving behind. They will always be left behind, so we have to move them to that center. We have taken them to a level that they responded to their own sisters when we do response. And that is very rare in communities. As able women, we went to response. Women and girls with disability don't come out. They are shy. They just being kept away from all of what is happening. And when we put women with disability in front while they are responding, you could see numerous families coming out of their houses saying that they also have a daughter in the house who is disability. Those are things that we've never seen before, but we make it happen because we believe that women and girls with disability also have a right in the humanitarian context, in climate change and disasters architecture, where they are included, so is everybody. They have the right to be in it as we do.
Thanks, Flora. And so let's not forget that important lens. And I think what's really powerful and what I've learnt, from the women with disabilities who make up, there's 1,000 in the network of 9,000. I think that's really important to remember. This isn't just tokenism, add a few women and feel like we're doing a good thing. It's a really amazing initiative where women are leading with the abilities they have. They're not being defined by their disability. And I think it's really, really powerful work. I think now we only have 2 minutes. So what I want to just ask from the panel as a wrap up, and before I do want to say we've got a great resource down here, Rosette Calmet. If you're interested in knowing about how women are using their Indigenous knowledge to drive nature-based solutions, please come talk to Rosette. She's leading that work in Vanuatu. And if we had have had another chair on the stage, we probably would have brought her up here and also learnt from her incredible experience. But so please do reach out to Rosette. But a final comment from all of you. I mean, what's your one recommendation around how we can better integrate gender and climate outcomes, particularly to lift the voices of First Nations and Pacific women? Or anything else you want to say? Because I can see Carolyn's thinking, what am I going to say in my last? You can go.
I'm just going to read directly from the script because I have 30 seconds. But as we're looking forward to the possibility of a Pacific COP, there is all of a sudden resourcing available for partnerships with Pacific-based civil society. But where will these partnerships lead to in the long run? And so we need to be honest with our motives and agenda as allies, because the last thing we want to do is add on to the trauma of those already living the climate crisis because of the historical action of industrial countries. There has to be political will to dedicate resources to support the gender integration in climate and disaster policies, because we know that commitments have already been made, but it's now time for them to act on it. They don't need to create whole new task forces and think tanks or even departments, but what our governments can do is continue to work with existing women's machineries to drive the work forward.
Sandra.
Yeah, I've only got a couple of words to say that. Don't have us as a token. Have us at the table. Understand our worth, understand our voice, and stop treating us like we're invisible and treating us like we have to remain silent. Take the gag of us. We have a voice, we have the knowledge, we have the wisdom. We are the human race that can move this world forward in climate change. Thanks.
Invest in locally led initiative and women leadership at the local level. Inclusive DRR and inclusive climate change is important in our society, so we need to invest and heavily resource them.
Thank you so much for joining us for this panel, and thank you to our three incredible speakers. I think you would all agree that if these women were in the room right at the moment, we would be out of negotiations, into decision making, and taking the world on the right pathway. Please give them a round of applause.